She was not crying for herself. The sound came from beneath the floor of the abandoned church just after midnight, soft enough to be mistaken for wind, steady enough to make Staff Sergeant Caleb Whitaker take his foot off the gas and look toward the broken steeple rising above Mercy Falls like a finger pointing at a sky that had forgotten how to answer. Rain slid down the windshield of his old Ford in silver lines, blurring the church windows into dark, uneven eyes. The building had been empty for years, locals said, ever since the county condemned the foundation and the last congregation moved 10 miles east to a newer chapel with better heat and no ghosts in the walls. Caleb knew the place. Everyone in that corner of West Virginia knew it. Mercy Chapel sat at the edge of a forgotten cemetery, half swallowed by weeds, its white paint peeled down to gray wood, its bell tower silent since before his last deployment. He had passed it 100 times without stopping. Tonight, he stopped. Not because he believed in signs. He did not. Not anymore. He stopped because the sound came again. 3 thin whimpers rising through the rain, then silence, then the faint scratch of claws against old timber. Caleb killed the engine. The truck ticked softly as it cooled. For a moment, the only sound was the storm tapping on the roof, the long hiss of tires passing far away on Route 52, and his own breathing, slow from habit, controlled from years of learning that fear moved faster when you fed it. He sat there with both hands on the wheel, watching the chapel doors shift in the wind. A chain hung loose through the handles. One stained glass window above the entrance still held the shape of a shepherd carrying a lamb, though half the glass was missing and the shepherd's face had been shattered by weather or stones. Caleb stared at it longer than he meant to. Then the whimper came again, lower this time, almost buried under the roll of thunder. A dog, German shepherd, if his ear was worth anything. Not barking, not warning, calling. Caleb reached for the flashlight in the glove box, then paused when his fingers brushed the small pair of dog tags lying in the cup holder. He had taken them out of his pocket at the Veterans Memorial earlier that evening because they felt too heavy against his chest. Corporal Mason Reed. Blood type O positive. United States Marine Corps. Caleb closed his hand around them without meaning to, feeling the cold metal bite his palm. Not tonight, he muttered, though he did not know whether he was speaking to the memory, the storm, or whatever waited under that church. He stepped out into the rain. Cold water struck his face and ran beneath the collar of his field jacket. The gravel lot had turned to mud, sucking lightly at his boots as he crossed toward the chapel. Every few steps, he stopped and listened. The sound below came once more, followed by scraping, then a dull thump, as if something weak had leaned against a door from the other side. Caleb lifted the flashlight. Its beam cut across the porch, over fallen leaves, bird droppings, and a rusted sign that still read "Come unto me" in faded blue letters. The words should have meant something. Once they had. Before Afghanistan. Before the desert sun. Before Mason's hand went slack in his, and the last prayer Caleb heard from a living man seemed to disappear into smoke. Since then, churches had felt less like houses of God and more like rooms where silence dressed itself in wood and glass. He climbed the 3 porch steps carefully. The boards groaned under his weight, but held. Up close, the chapel smelled of rain, old dust, wet cedar, and something faintly metallic rising from beneath the floor. Caleb slipped one hand through the loose chain and pushed the right door. It opened 6 inches with a tired moan. Inside, darkness breathed out. The flashlight found rows of empty pews coated in dust, hymnals swollen from moisture, a pulpit tilted slightly to one side, and water dripping into a dented collection plate left on the floor. Each drop rang like a small bell. Caleb moved slowly down the center aisle, his shoulders squared, eyes scanning corners, exits, shadows. He was no longer on patrol, but the body remembers what the mind tries to bury. Halfway to the altar, the whimper sounded directly beneath him. He froze. The floorboards trembled once under his boot. Then came the scratching again, urgent now, not random, not wild. 3 scratches. A pause. 3 more. Caleb crouched and lowered his flashlight to the seams in the wood. Through a narrow crack, he saw nothing at first but blackness. Then something amber flashed below. An eye. Watchful. Alive. The dog did not bark. She stared up through the darkness, panting softly, and the sound that followed was not fear. It was insistence. Caleb felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. "Easy, girl," he said, his voice low, roughened by rain and memory. "I hear you." The dog shifted beneath the floor, and the beam caught a smear of dark red on the edge of a broken plank. Not enough to tell a story, just enough to begin one. Caleb stood and swept the light toward the rear of the chapel, where an old side door sat behind the choir loft, half hidden by a fallen curtain and a stack of warped folding chairs. A basement door, padlocked from the outside. The dog below scratched again, harder this time, then gave one quiet whine that seemed to move through the whole building, through the pews, through the cracked glass, through Caleb's ribs. He looked at the lock. He looked at the dog tags clenched in his fist. Somewhere above him, wind moved through the broken steeple, and the dead bell gave the smallest sound. Not a ring, not even close, just a hollow metal breath. Caleb swallowed and stepped toward the basement door. "All right," he whispered. "Show me what you're guarding." Caleb reached the basement door, but his hand stopped inches from the padlock. The metal was old, blackened by rain and time, yet the chain looped through it was newer, clean enough that someone had fastened it there long after the church had been forgotten. That bothered him. Abandoned places carried a certain kind of neglect, dust on the rails, rust on the hinges, leaves pushed by wind into corners where no one cared enough to sweep them out. This lock did not belong to neglect. It belonged to a decision. Caleb angled the flashlight over the doorframe. Fresh scratches marked the wood near the latch, thin pale cuts beneath the grime, and lower down, at the height of a dog's shoulder, the paint had been rubbed away in a crescent. She had been there for a while. She had tried to get out, or tried to keep something in. Another sound rose from below, softer than before, and Caleb felt the old training in him settle into place. Do not rush the unknown. Listen first. Breathe. Count what the dark gives you. He leaned close to the door and caught the smell coming through the cracks. Damp stone, old cold dust, wet fur, and beneath it all, the faint sourness of fear that every Marine learned to recognize without ever naming it. His thumb moved across Mason Reed's dog tags inside his fist. The edges pressed into his skin, sharp enough to pull him backward through time. Not all at once. Never all at once. Memory came like weather through a broken window. A hot afternoon overseas. A chapel tent made from canvas and poles. Mason sitting on an ammunition crate with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, polishing a scratched silver cross he wore around his neck. He had been younger than Caleb by 3 years, too quick to smile, too patient with frightened new men, the kind of Marine who could make a joke under a gray sky and make everyone believe morning would come. Mason prayed before every convoy. Not loudly, not for show, just 2 fingers on that cross, head bowed for 3 seconds. Then he would look up and say, "All right, boys. Let us go home twice. Once in body, once in soul." Caleb used to laugh at that. Back then, faith had seemed like another piece of gear. You carried it because it kept your hands steady. You did not question it until the day your hands were not enough. The day Mason went down, there had been dust everywhere, not blood in Caleb's memory, not the things people imagine, just dust, sunlight, ringing ears, and Mason's face calm in a way Caleb hated because calm looked too much like surrender. Mason had gripped Caleb's wrist and whispered, "Tell my mother I prayed." Caleb had said, "You tell her yourself." Mason had almost smiled. Then the world narrowed to a silence Caleb had never escaped. After that, prayers felt like letters mailed to an empty house. He still stood for hymns when ceremonies required it. He still removed his cap near folded flags. He still said the right words to grieving families. But he had stopped expecting heaven to answer. And now, in a dead church at the edge of a West Virginia cemetery, something beneath the floor was scratching like it knew his name. Caleb exhaled and slid Mason's tags into his jacket pocket. He searched the choir loft and found a rusted iron candle stand leaning beside the old organ. The organ itself sagged against the wall, its yellowed keys exposed like old teeth, but the stand was solid. He wedged its base through the chain, braced one boot against the door, and pulled. The first attempt only made the hinges complain. The dog below let out one sharp whine, then fell quiet, as if she understood effort and was saving her strength. Caleb tried again, slower this time, using his weight instead of anger. The chain tightened. The wood creaked. Rain tapped harder on the roof, filling the chapel with 1,000 small fingers of sound. On the third pull, the hasp tore loose from the frame with a crack that echoed through the sanctuary. Caleb froze and listened. No human voice answered. No footsteps. Only the dog breathing below. He eased the door open. Cold air climbed out of the basement, damp and deep, carrying the kind of chill that did not touch skin first, but went straight to the bones. The staircase descended into darkness, narrow and steep, with water shining on each wooden step. Caleb tested the first board with his boot. It bowed, but held. He moved down carefully, one hand on the wall, flashlight low, every sense awake. 5 steps. 7. 10. The church above seemed to recede, the pews and pulpit and broken shepherd window becoming another world. At the bottom, the beam found stone walls sweating with rain, cardboard boxes collapsed in puddles, a stack of old hymnals tied with twine, and a German shepherd standing beneath a leaking pipe with her body angled between Caleb and a smaller door at the far end of the room. She was sable, dark along the back, lighter around the chest, with rainwater and dust clinging to her coat. Her ribs did not show badly, but hunger had narrowed her. One front paw hovered slightly above the floor, tender, not useless. Her ears were upright. Her amber eyes never left his. A worn working collar circled her neck, the leather dark with age. Caleb lowered himself 1 inch, making his shoulders smaller, his voice softer. "Easy, girl. I am not here to take anything from you." The shepherd gave a low sound in her chest. Not a threat. A warning. Caleb followed her gaze to the small door behind her. It was not part of the original basement. Someone had built it later, with pine boards and careful hinges. A faint line of warm cloth lay caught beneath it, blue and white, moving slightly as if touched by breath. Caleb's mouth went dry. The dog saw his eyes shift. She stepped sideways, weak but certain, blocking him again. Then she whimpered once, the same sound that had stopped him on the road, and lowered her head toward the door. Caleb understood. She was not asking him to leave. She was asking him to be gentle when he opened it. Caleb kept his flashlight low and steady, letting the beam rest on the floor instead of the shepherd's face. Animals read light the way soldiers read posture. Too much pressure, and trust vanished. He shifted his weight back from the little pine door and opened his left hand, showing her an empty palm. "I see it," he whispered. "I will go slow." The shepherd watched him for a long second. Rainwater dripped from the basement ceiling into a metal bucket somewhere behind him, each drop landing with a hollow note. The air was colder down here, thick with wet stone and old candle wax, and the only warmth seemed to come from that thin strip of cloth beneath the door. Blue and white. Moving. Caleb crouched lower, careful not to crowd her. "You have been holding this place all by yourself, have you?" The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, controlled breaths. Not panic. Discipline. That detail struck him. This was not a stray who had wandered into shelter and gotten trapped. She had the stillness of a working dog, the kind trained to make decisions when humans were too slow. Her collar, though worn, had once been expensive. The stitching was military grade. The buckle was scratched but polished by years of use. Around the leather hung no dangling tag, just a small metal plate turned inward against her throat. Caleb wanted to read it, but he did not reach. Not yet. The shepherd lowered her nose to the crack beneath the door and let out a quiet sound, softer than a whine, almost a breath. Something on the other side answered. Caleb did not move. He listened again. There it was. Not the pipe. Not the wind. A tiny, broken inhale, so faint it seemed impossible that any living thing could make it and still remain in the world. His throat tightened before his mind caught up. "Oh, Lord," he said, and the words came out before he could stop them. The shepherd looked at him then, not sharply, not in surprise, but as if she had been waiting for him to say something like that. Caleb swallowed. He had not used those words as prayer in years. They had become habit, reaction, a phrase said over drop tools and bad weather. But in that basement, beside a dog guarding a door, the words sounded different. Heavy. Hurt. He reached for the latch. The shepherd stepped closer, her body tense, then gently pressed her shoulder against his forearm, stopping him. Caleb froze. "Careful," he murmured, understanding the warning without knowing why. He moved his flashlight along the edge of the door and saw it. A loose board leaning against the inside, wedged in such a way that opening too fast might knock something over. He changed angle, lifted the latch with 2 fingers, and eased the door inward 1 inch. The board shifted but did not fall. He slid his hand through the gap, braced it, and opened the door slowly enough that the hinges barely whispered. The room beyond was small, no more than 8 feet wide, built into the old foundation like a secret someone had meant to keep safe. The flashlight revealed folded blankets stacked on a wooden bench, bottled water in a plastic crate, cans of soup, diapers, bandages, a lantern with a dead battery, and a simple wooden cross nailed crookedly above a shelf. This was not storage. This was refuge. Caleb's beam dropped to the floor. In the corner, inside a shallow cardboard box lined with towels and a dark wool coat, lay a newborn baby girl. She was wrapped in the blue and white cloth he had seen from outside, her face small and pale under the edge of the blanket, her mouth trembling around a cry too weak to become sound. For half a second, Caleb forgot how to breathe. The shepherd slipped past him at once, limping to the box. She lowered herself beside it, curling her body around the child without touching her too heavily, placing warmth where the room had none. Her nose nudged the blanket with impossible gentleness. The baby moved. Not much. Enough. Caleb set the flashlight on the floor so the beam bounced upward, softening the shadows. His hands that had worked radios, rifles, engines, field dressings, and folded flags, suddenly felt too large for the world. "Hey, little one," he said, his voice breaking around the words. "I have got you." He removed his jacket and laid it beside the box, then checked the baby the way training and fear told him to check. Breathing, color, warmth. She was cold, but not gone. Weak, but present. Fighting in that quiet way newborns sometimes do, with nothing but breath and God's stubborn mercy. Caleb pulled his phone from his pocket. 1 bar flickered, disappeared, then returned. He dialed emergency services and raised the phone toward the ceiling as if signal might be a kind of prayer. The call connected after 3 tries. "This is Staff Sergeant Caleb Whitaker," he said, steadying himself by giving facts first. "I am at the Old Mercy Chapel off Route 52, north side of Mercy Falls. I have an infant in the basement, alive but cold. I also have an injured German Shepherd K9 on scene. Send medical assistance and county deputies. The structure is unstable. Repeat, the structure is unstable." The dispatcher's voice crackled, asking questions. Caleb answered what he could. Age unknown. Newborn. Breathing. No visible injury. Possible exposure. He did not mention the way the shepherd watched him as if measuring whether he deserved to stand in that room. He did not mention the cross on the wall, or the coat wrapped around the baby, or the sudden ache behind his ribs that felt too close to faith. When the call ended, he looked more closely at the wool coat lining the box. There was a name, stitched in gold thread over the inside pocket, Pastor Elias Boone. Caleb knew that name. Everyone in Mercy Falls did. The old pastor who had run the food pantry, fixed porches for widows, and kept coffee hot for truckers passing through at dawn. The man who had disappeared nearly a week ago, though most folks assumed he had left to stay with family after the church closed. Caleb touched the embroidered name with 2 fingers. The shepherd gave a low, tired whimper and looked past him toward the back wall of the little room, where a narrow coal chute had been boarded over from the inside. Caleb followed her gaze. From beyond that wall came a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the rain. Not a baby, not a dog. 1 slow knock, then another. Caleb turned back to the shepherd. Her amber eyes held his, exhausted but certain. She had not led him to the end of the mystery. She had only brought him to the first door. Caleb crouched low beside the shepherd, keeping his hand close to hers without touching, letting her confidence seep into him. The small door beyond her hid more than he expected. He tested the boards with a cautious push and felt the faint give of something lightweight, yet protected beneath the wood. The shepherd moved as one with him, stepping slightly to the side, guiding him with subtle nudges and shifting weight. Caleb held his breath. The basement smelled of wet stone, candle wax, and something faintly sweet, like old paper and laundry soap left behind by someone who had tried to make this place a home. He leaned forward and eased the door open another inch. Light from the flashlight revealed a narrow corridor, no taller than 5 feet, running along the back of the basement, ending in a stack of crates. From somewhere inside, the baby whimpered softly again, and the shepherd's ears pricked. Caleb moved the flashlight along the corridor. Old wooden beams leaned against the wall, dust motes hanging like floating sparks in the beam. His boots made soft crunches on gravel that had been poured as a makeshift floor years ago. The shepherd pressed closer, her nose brushing his hand lightly as if to tell him, "Stay calm. Think first." He noticed a small chair overturned beside a crate, and, leaning against it, a folded quilt with faint embroidery. Something moved beneath the quilt. Caleb froze. The shepherd gave a low, soft exhale, and the baby's whimper turned into a more distinct sigh. Caleb bent and carefully lifted the edge of the quilt. Inside, he found a tiny bottle of water, a folded blanket, and a small, handmade cradle with the infant nestled safely. The girl stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and Caleb felt a rush of relief he had not realized he could feel so strongly in years. The shepherd leaned her head down, gently nudging the blanket tighter around the baby. Caleb glanced back toward the basement stairs. Rainwater still dripped from the ceiling, tapping in irregular rhythms onto buckets and scattered tools, and the faint sound of the church bell from the tower above, loosened by wind, echoed faintly, a hollow metallic voice. Caleb's heart beat steadily as he examined the cradle. The baby's cheeks were pale but not alarmingly so, her small fists curled against her chest. He whispered encouragement, letting the words fill the silence of the space. "You are safe now." The shepherd's amber eyes never left him, and he noticed the slight trembling in her legs from standing for so long. But there was no fear, only watchful determination. Caleb bent low and shifted the flashlight to examine the walls. Old markings etched into the stone revealed previous tenants' presence. Initials, small drawings of hearts and stars, left to occupy an otherwise abandoned and empty place. He imagined the shepherd had been witness to all of it, silently guarding what she was entrusted with. Caleb gently eased the cradle closer to him, still keeping one hand near the shepherd in case she needed reassurance, and carefully lifted the baby, feeling her warmth against his chest. The infant's tiny body responded immediately, curling into him as if recognizing safety instinctively. The shepherd shifted closer, her side brushing against his leg, guiding him toward the staircase without a word. Every step Caleb took felt deliberate, measured, the kind of movement drilled into him through years of field work. He counted each plank, each step, listening for creaks or cracks. The baby shifted slightly, and he adjusted his hold, mindful not to jostle her. Outside the corridor, the basement expanded slightly, revealing a large storage space where crates had been stacked haphazardly. Caleb noticed water pooling in the corners, some boxes warped by moisture, but the cradle remained untouched, protected as if by a force beyond the material. The shepherd positioned herself beside the narrow stairwell, and Caleb understood the silent instruction, "Lead, but do not rush." He lifted the baby higher, moving slowly, following the shepherd's subtle guidance, sensing every glance, every nudge. At the top of the stairs, he paused, feeling the basement air brush against his jacket, damp, cool, smelling of stone and the faint remnants of candle smoke. The shepherd stepped forward, pausing to glance up at him with a look of approval before moving slightly ahead, waiting. Caleb took a deep breath, steadying the baby against his chest, and began to ascend the stairs, the weight in his arms balanced by the quiet trust in the shepherd's presence. Each step deliberate, measured, until they emerged onto the damp basement floor where the porch light above cast a muted glow, rain dripping in shallow lines down the walls. Caleb exhaled, realizing for the first time in years that the act of following, of moving carefully and trusting instincts, could feel like more than survival. It could feel like hope. Caleb paused at the top of the basement stairs, listening to the rain patter against the chapel roof and the soft whines of the shepherd beside him. The infant in his arms shifted slightly, pressing her face against his chest as if she understood the protection surrounding her. He lowered the cradle to the floor of the basement landing, careful not to disturb the blankets, and watched the shepherd move with deliberate steps, her paws silent on the wet stone. She circled the small room, stopping at each corner, sniffing, then returning to stand beside Caleb. The air was thick with damp wood and candle residue, with a faint metallic tang that reminded him of old machinery left in warehouses during long deployments. Caleb ran his fingers over the embroidery on the blue and white cloth that had swaddled the infant, noticing the fine stitches, the care taken in its folding, and realized someone had created this space not only for survival, but for comfort, for hope. He looked around the basement more closely, shining the flashlight on a stack of wooden crates pushed against one wall, each marked with faded labels for food, clothing, and blankets. A small lantern lay on top, the wick blackened but unlit. The shepherd moved forward, nudging Caleb with her shoulder toward a narrow coal chute covered with old boards. Beneath it, he heard the faint sound of breathing, rhythmic, steady, and alive. Caleb knelt slowly, keeping his movements soft, eyes on the dog, noting how she stayed tense yet composed, guarding, watching, as if the room and all within it depended on her judgment. He eased the boards aside, revealing a small, hidden space where a young woman sat curled, her face pale and eyes wide, her hands cradling another small bundle, a second infant wrapped in tattered blankets. She blinked up at him, confusion and relief mingling on her features. The shepherd did not approach too closely, maintaining a protective stance, yet allowed Caleb to offer comfort with his steady presence. The woman whispered, barely audible, "I did not think anyone would find us." Caleb nodded, keeping his voice calm. "You are safe now. We will get you both out." He studied the room again, noting the careful placement of blankets, the makeshift bedding, the small offerings of food and water, and understood that this place had been a sanctuary, a secret kept from the outside world. The shepherd whined softly, then turned to the small corridor, indicating the path toward the staircase. Caleb followed her lead, lifting the first infant carefully, then reaching back for the second, his hands steady, the weight of both children balanced against his chest. Each step up the narrow stairs was deliberate, measured, the wood groaning beneath him but holding firm. Outside the corridor, he paused to glance back at the shepherd. Her eyes met his, amber, steady, intelligent, conveying understanding, approval, and the quiet insistence that they move carefully, respect the fragile lives under their care. Caleb exhaled slowly, feeling the tension ease slightly, the rhythm of the rain above and the soft breathing of the infants grounding him. He stepped into the basement landing, keeping his knees bent to lower the infants safely to the wider floor. The shepherd guided him to a clear path, away from puddles and debris. Caleb placed each infant gently on a clean blanket, checking their breathing, ensuring their warmth, and watching the shepherd settle near the first, resting her head lightly on the blanket without pressure, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger or disturbance. Caleb noticed the small wooden cross above the shelf once more, the crooked angle giving the room a sense of intentional imperfection, a reminder that even in the worst conditions, care and faith could create a haven. He adjusted the flashlight to illuminate the wider space, catching glimpses of faded hymnals, scattered cloths, and the subtle outlines of walls dampened by water. The shepherd shifted, placing herself between Caleb and the infants, alert, protective, and calm. Caleb crouched beside her, feeling the warmth of the animal, the quiet assurance of her presence. The infants cooed softly, responding to his voice and the subdued rustle of the dog's coat. Outside the basement door, rain continued to drum against the chapel roof, the sound echoing faintly through the empty space. Caleb could hear distant traffic along Route 52, but inside the basement, it was a separate world, one of patience, vigilance, and the unspoken bond forming between man, dog, and the tiny lives they protected. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, to steady his hands, and to observe the shepherd. She had led him here, and she would continue to guide them out. The weight of responsibility pressed on Caleb, not as fear, but as a focused, necessary concentration. Each decision mattered, every step calculated, each breath measured. He stood slowly, keeping the infants secure in his arms, and looked down the stairs toward the outside light that would soon guide them to safety. The shepherd stepped ahead, casting a shadow along the damp stone floor, signaling the route, her posture confident yet patient. Caleb nodded silently, gratitude mixing with the remnants of old guilt and memory, feeling the trust in her eyes, understanding that in this quiet, hidden place, a connection had been formed that would endure beyond this night. The first sound of sirens came faintly through the rain, distant and thin, like a memory trying to find its way home. Caleb heard it before the others did, before the young woman lifted her head, before the shepherd's ears turned toward the chapel door, before the infants stirred beneath the blankets on the cleared patch of basement floor. Blue and red light began to pulse through the broken stained glass above, spilling down into the sanctuary in soft, fractured colors that moved across the old pews like water. Help was close, but close was not safe yet. Caleb had learned that lesson in places where rescue could be seen on the horizon and still arrive too late if one careless step stole the remaining minutes. He knelt beside the young woman, keeping his voice low so the babies would not startle. "What is your name?" She swallowed, her lips dry, her eyes moving from Caleb to the shepherd and back again. "Emily Carter." The name came out as if it had been stored somewhere fragile. "My girls are Lily and Hope." Caleb nodded once, not asking questions faster than she could answer them. "Emily, medical help is here. I need you to stay with me. Can you walk?" She tried to shift her legs, then winced and leaned back against the stone wall, exhausted more than injured, worn down by cold, hunger, fear, and the long silence of waiting for footsteps that had not come until tonight. "I do not know," she whispered. "Pastor Boone said he would come back. He went to find the deputy. He said the storm was getting worse, and the girls needed help." Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed gentle, as if even grief had to speak quietly in that hidden room. Grace would not leave them. She kept coming back. Every time I thought she had gone, she came back with something. A bottle, a blanket, once a pack of crackers from the shelf. Caleb looked at the German shepherd. Grace. The name settled over the room like a candle being lit. The dog stood near the blankets, her sore paw barely touching the floor, her body swaying from fatigue, but her attention fixed on the basement stairs. She had heard the boots above. She had heard radios crackling. She had heard strangers entering the church, and still she did not panic. She only placed herself between the babies and the world, as though duty had bones and fur and amber eyes. A voice called from the sanctuary. "Sheriff's Department. Anyone down there?" Caleb lifted his head. "Basement. We have 2 infants, 1 adult female, and an injured canine. Move slow. Stairs are weak." Footsteps stopped above. A flashlight beam swept across the doorway. Then Deputy Aaron Mills appeared at the top of the stairs, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his expression tight with concern. He was in his early 40s, broad-faced, clean-shaven, wearing a dark county jacket over his uniform. He had the tired look of a man used to bad calls in small towns. But when he saw Caleb holding one of the babies close beneath his jacket, that tiredness cracked. "Dear God," Aaron breathed. Caleb did not answer. He did not trust himself to. 2 paramedics came behind the deputy, carrying soft blankets and medical bags, but Grace gave a low warning sound the moment the first one descended too quickly. Not a snarl, not aggression, a boundary. Caleb raised one hand. "Slow down. She is guarding them. Let her see your hands." The younger paramedic stopped at once and lowered his bag to the step. "Easy, girl," he said, palms open. Grace watched him. Her ears stayed forward. Caleb crouched beside her, close enough for his shoulder to brush her neck. "They are here to help," he murmured. "You did your job." At those words, something in the dog softened. Only a little. Enough. She stepped back 1 pace and allowed the paramedics to reach the infants. Lily went first, wrapped in a warmed blanket, her tiny face tucked near the medic's chest. Hope followed, quieter, her small hand uncurling as if reaching for the warmth leaving the room. Emily tried to follow with her eyes, panic rising. Caleb saw it and leaned closer. "They are not leaving without you." Emily nodded, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. "Pastor Boone told me this place was for people who had nowhere safe to go," she said. "He said Mercy Chapel still had 1 good room left in it." Deputy Mills looked toward the shelves, the food crates, the folded clothes, the ledger on the bench with names written in careful blue ink. His jaw tightened, but not with anger at Emily. With recognition. With the weight of all the things a town chooses not to see because seeing would require action. Caleb noticed the ledger too. Veterans. Widows. Mothers. Men passing through with no address. Pastor Boone had been keeping a quiet shelter beneath a condemned church, not for praise, not for money, but because someone had to leave a light on. Thunder rolled overhead, and a thin stream of water suddenly spilled down the far wall, darker and faster than before. The basement had begun to take on the storm. Aaron looked up. "We need to move now." A sharp crack sounded from somewhere behind the old coal chute. Everyone froze. Grace turned first. Her head snapped toward the boarded passage, and a breathless whine escaped her. Caleb followed her gaze. The dog took 2 limping steps away from the stairs, away from safety, toward the darker end of the room. Caleb's chest tightened. "Grace," he said softly. She did not look back. She pressed her nose to the boards near the coal chute and scratched once. Then again. Beneath the rain, beneath the sirens, beneath the rising water, there came a faint tapping from the other side. Not random. Not wind. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. Deputy Mills whispered, "Someone else is back there." Caleb looked down at Grace, at the trembling strength still holding her upright, and understood with a quiet chill that she had not been guarding 2 babies alone. She had been guarding a whole truth the town had buried beneath silence. Caleb followed Grace to the far end of the basement where the coal chute had been boarded over, the soft scratching of her paws against the stone floor echoing in the still air. The tapping from the other side became clearer, deliberate, as if someone was waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. He crouched low, flashlight in hand, tracing the outline of the boards and noting the small gaps between them where light from above barely filtered through. Grace shifted beside him, her amber eyes steady and unwavering, a living compass pointing towards something hidden, something waiting for recognition. Caleb pressed his hand to the boards and felt the faint vibration of a tiny voice beyond, so soft that it could have been mistaken for the hum of dripping water. "Hold on," he whispered. He crouched beside the shepherd, drawing in a steady breath. Years of training told him to assess, observe, plan, and only then act. He tapped gently on the boards and, after a pause, the faint sound shifted, almost a reply. Caleb's mind raced, recalling the ledger he had seen earlier, the names carefully written in blue ink, the quiet work Pastor Boone had done to provide sanctuary. The sound beyond the wall seemed connected to that work, a human presence left behind, waiting to be found. He knelt and placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. The dog did not flinch. She leaned into the touch, steady and confident, as if telling him that trust was required now more than ever. Caleb looked back toward Emily and the infants, ensuring they were secure, then turned fully to the boards, gripping a crowbar with careful precision. He eased it beneath the edge and began to lift, small increments, listening to the response of the wood. Each creak, each soft groan of the boards gave information. Grace's eyes never left his movements, her body alert, ready to intervene if anything threatened the fragile room beyond. As the last board shifted slightly, a narrow opening appeared, just enough to see inside. Caleb crouched lower, bringing the flashlight through the gap, revealing the small shape of a man curled against the wall, his features pale, clothes damp from the rising moisture. Relief and caution mingled in Caleb's chest. He extended one hand slowly, letting the man see it was empty, open, safe. The man stirred, blinking against the sudden light, recognizing help without words. Caleb shifted his weight, keeping his back toward the infants and Emily, and gently guided the boards aside, widening the gap. The shepherd moved ahead cautiously, ensuring the path was clear, then stepped back to allow Caleb to reach the hidden space. He knelt beside the man and whispered assurances, steadying the figure without startling him, noting the way Grace maintained her protective position between them and the stairs. The man's breathing was uneven but steadying as Caleb assessed the situation. He made eye contact with Grace, silently acknowledging the dog's role in maintaining calm and order. Outside, the storm raged, rain striking the roof in relentless sheets, but inside the basement, the combination of human care and canine vigilance created a pocket of stability. Caleb reached for his radio to confirm that emergency personnel could proceed safely, giving detailed instructions for evacuation and support. Grace whined softly, nudging Caleb's knee, signaling it was time to move forward. Caleb carefully helped the man to his feet, supporting him as they maneuvered toward the staircase, the infants and Emily waiting at the top. Each step upward was measured, deliberate, and synchronized with Grace's guidance. The dog's presence reassured the hidden man, and he followed Caleb's lead without resistance. Reaching the landing, Caleb paused, ensuring everyone was balanced and safe, the weight of the moment pressing on him. The infants stirred but remained calm, recognizing the stability and care in Caleb's movements. Rainwater continued to drip through the cracks above, creating a rhythm that underscored the urgency of leaving the basement. Caleb glanced at Grace one final time in that space, acknowledging the quiet heroism of her watchful patience, and then guided the group carefully toward the top step, where Deputy Aaron Mills and the paramedics were ready to assist. Each individual step carried a mixture of exhaustion and relief, the collective awareness of danger and trust forming an unspoken bond that carried them safely out of the basement, into the light and the sound of the approaching assistance. At the top of the basement stairs, the sanctuary no longer looked empty. Flashlights moved through the broken pews in slow arcs. Paramedics knelt beside Emily and the twins near the center aisle, wrapping them in warm blankets beneath the pale glow of emergency lanterns. Deputy Aaron Mills stood by the old pulpit, radio pressed to his mouth, rainwater streaming from his sleeves onto the warped floorboards. The man Caleb had helped from behind the coal chute sat on the front pew, shivering beneath a silver thermal blanket, his white hair plastered to his forehead, his hands trembling around a paper cup of water. For a few moments, no one said his name. The old church seemed to hold it back, as if names mattered more in places where people had nearly been forgotten. Then Emily lifted her head, saw him clearly, and whispered, "Pastor Boone." The old man turned toward her. His eyes were tired, gray, and full of apology. "Emily," he said, his voice thin but gentle. "The girls? Safe?" Caleb answered before she could try to move. "Both of them." Pastor Elias Boone closed his eyes. His mouth moved without sound, not in performance, not for anyone watching, but in the quiet language of a man who had spent his life believing help could still come through a locked door. Grace stood between the pews, swaying slightly, her sore paw lifted, her coat damp and dusty, her body refusing rest even after every person she had guarded had reached the light. Caleb noticed it before the others did. She was fading on her feet. "Grace," he said softly. The shepherd turned her head toward him, and for the first time that night, her eyes lost some of their command. She had spent everything. Caleb stepped close and lowered himself to one knee. "Come here, girl." She hesitated, not from fear, but from duty. Her gaze moved to Emily, then to the infants, then to Pastor Boone. Only after checking each one did she limp toward Caleb. He reached for her carefully, fingers moving under the collar at her neck, meaning only to steady her. That was when he felt the small metal plate hidden against the inside of the leather. He froze. The plate was turned inward, pressed flat beneath the worn strap, almost invisible unless someone held the dog close enough to feel what time had concealed. Caleb tilted it gently toward the lantern light. Mud and age dulled the engraving, but the letters were still there. Property of Corporal Mason Reed. Search and Rescue K-9 Grace. For a long second, the room emptied around him. The rain became distant. The radios faded. The voices above and behind him thinned into nothing. Caleb stared at the name until it blurred. Mason Reed. Not a memory now. Not a folded flag. Not dog tags cold in a cup holder. A name carved into the collar of a living creature who had found him in the one place he refused to enter. Caleb's hand tightened around the leather, not enough to hurt her, only enough to keep himself from drifting backward into the old desert light. Mason had talked about a shepherd named Grace during long nights overseas, a dog he had trained before deployment, a dog who could track a missing child through rain, find a lost hiker in brush, sit beside a frightened stranger, and make them breathe slower without a single command. "She knows when someone is worth staying for," Mason had once said, smiling into a tin cup of bad coffee. Caleb had forgotten that line. Or maybe he had buried it, because remembering anything soft about Mason made the loss harder to carry. Grace leaned her head against Caleb's chest. Not dramatically, not like a scene made for applause. Just the weight of trust, warm and tired, pressing through his jacket. Caleb bowed over her before he could stop himself. His forehead touched the damp fur between her ears. "You were his," he whispered. Grace breathed out, a small, worn sound, and the metal plate tapped softly against his fingers. Pastor Boone looked over from the pew, following Caleb's gaze to the collar. "Corporal Reed," he said faintly. Caleb turned. "You knew Mason?" The pastor nodded, gathering strength between breaths. He brought her here once, years ago, before his last deployment. Said if anything ever happened to him, she should still have work that mattered. Search, rescue, comfort, whatever Mercy needed. His eyes moved toward Emily and the babies. When the county closed the church, Grace kept coming back. I thought it was habit. Maybe it was more. Deputy Mills lowered his radio. No one spoke for a few seconds. Even the paramedics seemed to move more quietly. Caleb looked down at Grace, and the old anger inside him shifted, not leaving, not yet, but loosening like a knot soaked by rain. He had asked heaven for Mason to come back. Heaven had not answered the way he demanded. It had sent a dog through years of storms, through closed doors, through hunger and darkness, carrying the last echo of his friend's promise until Caleb was finally close enough to hear it. Another low groan passed through the chapel floor. Aaron looked toward the basement door. We need everyone out now. The foundation was taking on too much water. Caleb stood, one arm under Grace's chest to support her weight. She tried to resist, tried to turn once more toward the hidden room below, but Caleb held her gently. No, he said, voice shaking. Your watch is over. Grace looked at him, searching his face, and then, as if she understood both the command and the mercy behind it, she let her body rest against him. Caleb lifted her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been. Outside, the rain had softened to a silver mist. Emergency lights washed the cemetery in red and blue, turning the wet headstones into quiet witnesses. Caleb carried Grace down the chapel steps as paramedics guided Emily, the twins, and Pastor Boone toward the ambulances. At the edge of the porch, the broken bell above them stirred in the wind and gave one clear note at last, small but unmistakable, ringing once over Mercy Falls like something lost had finally found its voice. By the time dawn reached Mercy Falls, the storm had passed into the mountains, leaving the cemetery washed clean and the old chapel shining with water beneath a pale gold sky. Mist clung low to the grass. Drops slid from the broken stained glass and fell one by one onto the porch steps where muddy boot prints, paw prints, and the narrow tracks of stretcher wheels crossed over each other like proof that life had moved through the dark and come out breathing. Caleb sat on the tailgate of his truck with a wool rescue blanket around his shoulders, though he did not remember anyone putting it there. Across the gravel lot, the ambulances idled quietly. Emily rested inside one of them, warm and safe, with Lily and Hope wrapped close beside her under the watch of two paramedics who spoke in low voices and smiled every time one of the babies moved. Pastor Boone sat in another ambulance with an oxygen mask lowered beneath his chin, stubbornly answering Deputy Mills's questions even as the emergency medical technician kept telling him to save his strength. The old pastor looked smaller in daylight, but not weaker. Some people seemed to carry their strength in their shoulders. He carried his in the way he looked at those babies, as if every cold night beneath that chapel had been worth this morning. Grace lay on a folded blanket at Caleb's feet, while the veterinarian from the next town, Dr. Hannah Price, wrapped her sore paw and checked her ribs with careful hands. Grace tolerated every touch, but her amber eyes kept returning to Caleb. Not needy, not afraid, just certain, as if she had decided he was part of her watch now, and that decision had weight. Caleb reached down and rested his fingers lightly against her neck, where Mason's name still hid against the inside of the collar. He had not taken it off. He did not think he could. Deputy Mills walked over after a while, his boots dark with mud, his face worn by a night that would follow him for years. County records confirm it, he said quietly. Pastor Boone had been keeping that shelter running for months, maybe longer. Food pantry supplies, donated blankets, old cots, medicine from a clinic drive. He wrote everything down. Names, dates, who needed help, who got back on their feet. Caleb looked toward the church. In the morning light, it seemed less abandoned and more tired, like something that had been waiting for someone to notice it was still useful. Aaron followed his gaze. People complained about him, said he was attracting trouble, said the building was a hazard. Maybe they were not wrong about the hazard. He paused, but they missed the mercy. Caleb did not answer. He watched Dr. Price finish wrapping Grace's paw. The dog gave a quiet sigh and lowered her head onto her front legs, exhausted at last. Emily's voice came, softly from the ambulance. Sergeant. Caleb stood and walked over. She was pale, wrapped in blankets, one hand resting over the tiny bundle nearest her heart. Is Grace all right? She is going to be, Caleb said. Emily nodded, tears gathering again, though this time they carried something gentler. She stayed with us. When I thought no one knew we were there, she knew. When the girls got cold, she lay against the box. When I could not keep my eyes open, she nudged my hand until I answered her. I kept telling her to go find help. Emily looked past him to the shepherd. I think she did. Caleb felt the words settle in him. Not like thunder. Not like revelation. More like a hand placed on a shoulder after years of standing alone. Pastor Boone lifted his head from the next ambulance and spoke with the faintest smile. Grace has always been good at finding the lost. Caleb turned toward him. The old pastor's eyes were clearer now. Mason believed that, Pastor Boone said. He told me once that dogs do not ask whether a soul deserves saving. They just go where the need is. Caleb looked down at Mason's dog tags in his palm. He had taken them from his pocket sometime before sunrise and held them without noticing. The metal was warmer now from his skin. For years, those tags had been evidence of failure, proof of one prayer unanswered. But standing there beside the chapel, with two newborn girls alive, their mother safe, an old pastor breathing, and Grace watching him through tired eyes, Caleb began to understand that unanswered did not always mean unheard. Sometimes the answer took the long road. Sometimes it wore fur. Sometimes it waited beneath a broken church floor until the right wounded man finally stopped his truck in the rain. He walked back to Grace and knelt beside her. The morning sun reached through the shattered shepherd window and fell across them both, turning the dust in the air to gold. Caleb slipped Mason's dog tags over his own neck, then touched the small plate on Grace's collar. He kept his promise through you, he whispered. Grace lifted her head just enough to press her nose against his wrist. Caleb closed his eyes. He did not make a speech. He did not tell anyone that his faith had returned. Some things were too sacred to announce. He only bowed his head in the wet grass beside a tired German shepherd and let one quiet sentence rise from the place in him he thought had gone silent forever. Thank you. The broken bell above Mercy Chapel moved one